All right, today we're cracking open a file that was once stamped top secret state importance. Now, this isn't about battlefield tactics or military strategy. No, this is about Generalplan Ost, a chilling, bureaucratic blueprint for a horrifying alternate future for all of Eastern Europe. To really get our heads around this plan, we're going to start with a little thought experiment. And this one's, well, it's going to get personal. We're going to look at a world that almost was. A world that was specifically engineered so that you and millions of people just like you would simply not exist. Just imagine that for a second. No victory parades, no memorials, no celebrations of liberation. Nothing. It's just a Tuesday. An ordinary day in a very, very different world. A world where the war in Europe, well, it ended differently. Look, this isn't some dusty, abstract history lesson. The plan we're about to dissect was a detailed, almost mathematical blueprint for genocide. Its success would have directly meant that entire family lines would have been wiped out, and that quite possibly includes your own. In this alternate reality, your whole identity gets stripped away. An entire group of people with thousands of years of history and culture is just recategorized. You're not a person anymore, you're a function, a living, breathing instrument of labor, and you only exist to serve. So how would they maintain that control? Simple. You systematically erase knowledge. Just try to imagine an entire society where education is forbidden, where the highest intellectual goal that's set for you is to count to 500 and be able to sign your own name. That's it. Nothing more. So, where did a nightmarish vision like this even come from? Well, it wasn't some spontaneous act of wartime cruelty. Oh no. It was a meticulously crafted plan, born from decades of ideology and cold academic calculation. And it's so important to understand what this plan was not. It wasn't scribbled on a napkin by some madman. It was a series of dry, bureaucratic reports full of charts and tables drafted by academics and civil servants. The true horror of it is just how banal it was, how cold and calculated. Yeah, this thing didn't just appear out of a vacuum. It was really the final logical step of an ideology that had been around for a long time. The idea of living space in the East had been simmering for a century. Hitler just provided the engine, and SS professors, guys like Meyer Hedling, who is an expert in agricultural science of all things, drew up the landscape design. A design that treated entire nations like weeds you just needed to uproot. Okay, so let's be brutally clear about what resettled actually meant. It was a euphemism, a lie. There was nowhere for these tens of millions of people to go. Resettlement meant deportation to Siberia under absolutely impossible conditions. It was a death sentence, delivered through starvation, disease, and forced labor. And just in case you think there was any ambiguity, Nazi officials like Dr. Wetzel spelled it out right there in their own internal memos. This wasn't about defeating an army or toppling a government. The goal was the biological obliteration of an entire people. So what about the few who were supposed to survive? You know, the 15% of Poles, the 25% of Belarusians. You might think they were the lucky ones. They weren't. Their fate was a life meticulously designed to be one of permanent, hopeless servitude. The plan was to basically rewind society back to a brutal form of medieval feudalism. German SS veterans would become the new lords of the land, living in fortified manors. And the rest, the vast majority of the population, they'd effectively be their property, living in barracks and working the fields. I mean, look at this. This is what a curriculum for subjugation looks like. Heinrich Himmler laid it out himself. The goal wasn't to educate, it was to domesticate, to create a population that was just smart enough to follow orders but completely incapable of critical thought, of rebellion, or even of reading a history book to know what was taken from them. And this quote from Martin Bormann, it just lays out the whole policy on health. No real medical care for you, no vaccinations. In fact, abortions were encouraged. If an epidemic like typhus broke out in a village, the official policy was to just cordon it off and let everyone inside die. It was population control through calculated, cold-blooded neglect. But there was another piece of this plan, and it's maybe the most perverse part of the whole thing. It wasn't just about destroying bodies, it was about stealing souls, specifically the souls of children who were deemed to have valuable blood. Just let that number sink in. 200,000 children from Poland alone, and tens of thousands more from the Soviet Union. SS racial commissions would literally sweep through villages and orphanages looking for kids with so-called Nordic features. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and then those children were just taken from their families forever. Once they were taken to these special Lebensborn homes in Germany, their identities were just systematically erased. They were given new German names. If they spoke a single word of their native language, they were beaten. They were told their parents were dead. They were raised to be true Aryans, supposedly rescued from barbarians. It was the complete murder of a child's memory. Now, over the years, some really dangerous myths have popped up about this history. And maybe the most persistent and, frankly, foolish one is that if Germany had won, life would somehow be better. You hear this thing, we'd be drinking Bavarian beer. The Nazis' own documents tell a very different story. Yeah, that idea of a higher standard of living, it's a total fantasy. Let's just blow that myth right out of the water. Hitler's direct instructions were clear. The local population was to be given unlimited vodka and tobacco to basically accelerate their degradation. You weren't getting Bavarian beer. You were getting cheap spirits to hasten your demise and free up living space. Some nationalists hoped the Nazis would be liberators, that they'd grant them independence. That was a fatal mistake. The plan was for total colonization. As Erich Koch, the Reichskommissar of Ukraine, so brutally put it, their policy was to actually encourage ethnic violence to make it easier to rule. It was divide and conquer in its most vicious form. And this is probably the most insidious myth of all. The idea that this was a war against communism. The Nazis didn't care if you were a communist or a monarchist. Your political beliefs were totally irrelevant. The attitude was basically, I don't care about your party card, I care about your skull. The only thing that mattered was your race, your blood. You were slated for destruction or slavery simply because of who you were born. Now, thankfully, Generalplan Ost was never fully realized. It was stopped cold at Moscow, its back was broken at Stalingrad, and it was finally buried in Berlin. But its implementation had already begun. The burned villages, the slave laborers, the siege of Leningrad, all of these were the first terrible drafts of the future that was planned for everyone. So here's the bottom line. When we talk about victory in 1945, it's not just about geopolitics or shifting borders. For the peoples of Eastern Europe, it was a matter of biological salvation. Full stop. The alternative to winning that war wasn't just subjugation. It was to be completely erased from the face of the earth. We have to know these plans. We have to understand the true nature of the evil that humanity was up against. The freedom to simply live, to learn, to speak our own languages, that was all won at an unimaginable cost. Forgetting what the alternative was, that's a risk we just can't afford to take.